It's the BCS Podcast.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Brett Chats Sport, or BCS Podcast. This week we're going to be doing things a little bit differently in that we are going to focus predominantly on the issue of sports betting. And to help me with that, my guest this week is a gentleman called Russell Eassom. As you will find out from the chat that we're about to have, he has had issues with sports betting in the past, and so he's a great person to be able to speak on this issue and give insight into the dangers of sports betting, shall we say. And so without further ado, I give you Russell Eassom. Hey Russell, thank you very much for joining the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing good, Brett. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm going to dive straight into it. Let's introduce you first and foremost. We kind of know each other. We both work for the British baseball website Batflips and Nerds that I've mentioned in previous episodes. I'm a writer and a team editor, whereas you're also a writing contributor, but you're also the co-host of the podcast as well. So thank you very much for appearing on my podcast.
No worries. Yeah, it's the podcast, the site. It's brought a lot of British baseball fans together, so it's always great to see it continue to kind of go through generations, which I think is part of what it is, because it's not a paid gig, so it's it takes people's time when they have it, and it's great to see different people coming up and being yeah, I'm willing to give it my time.
Yeah. So, and how did you? I mean, well, we'll get in. Actually, no, we'll get into how you got involved, because it that very much feeds into the thing that we're going to discuss today. There's an article on the Batflips and Nerds website that you wrote, and I was very glad to be able to sub on your behalf. And frankly, for me, it's the best thing that has been published on that website since I got involved with Batflips and Nerds, which was about 2.5 years ago now. And the article is called "Warning from a Small Island: The Effects of Sports Gambling in the UK." And it's very much led by your experience of the effects of the sports gambling laws in the UK. And I will put the link to the article into the description for this site, into the description of this episode. I do apologise, so that all of you can read it, because again, as I say, best thing I've been involved in since I got involved with Batflips and Nerds, and Batflips and Nerds does wonderful things. So take from that what you will.
Cheers,
please. So let's get into it. What is your relationship? What was your relationship with sports gambling?
Yeah, so I think I am the perfect age for the boom of what was sports gambling in the UK. I am, at the time of recording, 35. So effectively, I hit my teenage years just when sports gambling was still something you had to go to the bookies to do. So you would, if you wanted to put a bet on, I remember I talked to my dad, and he would bet on the Grand National once a year, and I knew that he had to go to a bookies to do this, and he'd ask us when we were a bit younger, or pick a random horse name or whatever, and that was very much my idea of sports gambling when I grew up. When I started to hit 17, 18, I'd start to go to the pub and watch games. There was a Ladbrokes right next to the pub that I would go to, and the Ladbrokes itself would even put the betting sheets in the pub with the red pens, the little red pens, to get you to do those sorts of things. And at that point, I had some part-time jobs or whatever. We would watch the football, and it would be fun to put a bet on, to be well, I think this is going to happen. I'm going to go watch the game, so let's put something on the result, or put something on a score, or a first goal scorer. I don't know. I was probably spending maybe £10-20 a weekend. Nothing. It's nothing to even cry about. Obviously, back then it was maybe 3 or 4 hours of minimum wage, as it used to be back then. But it was none of it. It was just kind of what it was. But what kind of grew after that, and I think what grew really strong, was that was then the time that we all got to know bet in play, where it became the concept of smartphones just blew up. So you then got to the point where you could very easily not have to go next door and put a bet on to do that. You could use your smartphone and you could place a bet on while you were sat down in the pub while you're watching something in front of you. And to me, like that very much that kind of in-play betting, that spot betting is what really kind of drew me in, because I was like, I'm watching something. I class myself as an intelligent person, and there are times where I think that I know more than other people. It is an arrogance, I 100% admit, but like I do class myself as that. So I was watching sport sometimes being like, nah, those odds are wrong. Like, I'm gonna do that, and for a reasonable amount of time, probably for like the first couple of years, going to like university and watching games with friends, I'd just go watch games and bet while I was like watching games. Nothing really kind of like to write home about. But when you are at university and at times you have a lot of downtime.
Exactly. Yes, I agree.
At times, well, the choice of whether you actually choose to go to your lectures or not is another thing, but you can have lots of downtime. And that's when I started to be like, oh, I think, as I said, I think I'm smarter than other people. I started to kind of like really look into like sports analytics, really started to kind of pick up that side of what is stuff I kind of like my day job now. It's like I do data science work, I do all these sorts of things. Actually, I think I learned more about that from kind of like looking into statistics for sports betting than I ever actually did like at university. But what that did is it gave me this confidence that I knew better than like the market. And I would then start to bet, and for a while, did okay. Spent a lot of time doing it, realized that I was basically not really actually earning minimum wage from the amount of time that I was spending kind of like researching all of these sorts of things. And so to kind of think about that, I then got to the point where I was like, well, if I want to actually make money, I got to spend more money and I've got to do things that are riskier to kind of do this. And it just, from that sort of moment, it just like, it slowly escalated. I very much like to look at things like watching in-play football. I built odds basically around like if someone's 2-0 up with like 5 minutes to go, like it's like less than a 1% chance in like European leagues that the team comes back and gets a draw out of the game. So I'd look at basically the odds, bet in play, find games that had like 5 minutes to go, someone 2-0 up, and just put it on the winner. So these are always like lots of like short odds. And we just do it and do it and do it. And yeah, I did okay. But the first kind of step in when I realized that things weren't quite right is that I was disassociating like money from what I was doing. Me and my friends would talk about it in the concept of like, oh, how many eggs did you bet on the game yesterday? Which is like, it's a weird thing to kind of talk about, but that disassociation from like actually thinking like you're spending money to just kind of like you're using just an arbitrary thing to describe it. It loses like, you don't then think about like what the impact is.
Okay, so talk to me. Right, so I'll be very upfront and honest here. Like, I've only ever placed two bets in my life. One was on the results of who was going to win the 2006 World Cup, FIFA World Cup, and men's edition, and the other was who was going to win the 2018 men's FIFA World Cup, and I won both of those bets. That never encouraged me to bet more. I never thought, oh, okay, I've won, so I'm going to bet again. Like, so, and you know, if this is true of me, I'm going to assume it's going to be true of some people, at least some people who are listening to this. What is going on in your mind that was making you say, right, let's keep betting, even though you haven't had success? Like, because, you know, back to me, I can't quite understand. So what's going through your mind in that situation?
Yeah, I think there's like a bit of like the gambler's fallacy when you're committed or pot committed. So you're kind of then you just throw more at it to try and kind of like make sure that you kind of get back your losses by kind of like betting more. I think other sides of it is it still comes down to my upbringing. I went to a grammar school. I had the smoke blown up my ass that like you're amazing, you're intelligent or whatever, and I believed it. And I believed that I was better than And for a while, you take losses, and I'd be like, nah, the system's right. It's just going to take time for it to kind of kick through. If you think about it from a baseball perspective, I'm like, no, my swing is true. I'm just not getting the outcomes that
Sure.
like we kind of work. But the system will work. We'll continue on it. Like the system like will work. And then yeah, it got to the point where yeah, the system wasn't working. Like I wasn't losing like ridiculous amounts of money, but I was getting to the point where even like at university, we'd go on a night out and I'd be like, ah, can you spot us a tenner?
Okay.
Not
So
to be like I was struggling to pay rent or anything like that, but it got to that point where I was like, I didn't have the disposable I was using all of my disposable income or more of my disposable income to actually like bet.
okay. So I suppose the question has to be when did it become a problem for you? When were you not only spending your disposable income?
Yeah, so I think that was probably to me as like my final year at university where you definitely have a lot of spare time. You have a massive project that you're kind of supposed to kind of do and work on.
Hmm.
And if I'm perfectly honest, I smashed that and I had basically so much free time to do on this. I was playing online poker. I was uh like using that to kind of make a bit of money here and then, basically sports betting all the time. And so it got to the point where, yeah, like I was just using up my entire day to do this. And when I'd go out, I'd be like, man, I don't actually have any money. And all my friends would be like, what are you doing, Russell? Like you're like you talk all the time about like you're betting wins or whatever, and you're chatting S to all the time about every time that like a good result comes in, but you're saying you got no money, and that was the point. It didn't hit me then. It hit me like probably a couple of months later, where I was still trimming that kind of that line where I was like, I was just below like returns on my money, and so just losing like a small amount each week and each week and each week. But when I'm saying losing a small amount, I'm losing like 20-30 quid a week, but I'm betting like £1,000 worth of stuff in that week. So
Oh
because
wow.
like
Okay.
how much betting I'm doing like within a time period, I'm betting a lot of money, but like losing like a very like small amount, like taking almost like 47% like winnage like on that,
Hmm.
almost effectively like betting on red on a roulette table like that whole entire time, just taking like that small loss and small loss and small loss, but thinking like I was going to do well. And it got to one point where yeah, I just have to say like I have a friend Giuseppe at university who was somebody that I used to bet with quite a lot. We used to discuss about these sorts of things, and he kind of got to the point where he was just like, Russell, I think you actually have a problem here.
Hmm.
Like, and it, to come from him, like I think other people had said it to me before, but I hadn't quite taken notice because once again it's still a little bit of arrogance. But like no, you don't understand it. Like these are all the things. But I was like, Giuseppe understood it. Like,
Hmm.
and he was like, no, mate, like you're not doing this for fun. You're not doing this with like a system that's actually like making you money. You're just slowly losing money. And yeah, we had a heart to heart. We had a conversation, and it was kind of like, yeah, I don't think this is any good.
Yeah, and that's the thing that made you stop, is it? Is that friend intervening
Yeah,
on your behalf?
pretty much. Like, I think I know I had a addictive like personality. Like when I play like video games, new video games that come out, I will play that video game for like 60 hours and then be done with it. But I have that like idea of mentality of like when I get into something, I get into something. But then I'm quite lucky that I also like as soon as I actually realized that wasn't too far along, kind of like being too far in, if that makes sense. I was capable enough of still kind of going, actually, yes, you know what, like we've had this discussion. This isn't a good place. Deleted like the apps off my phone, deleted like the things on off my kind of off my computer, and I was like Peppy, if you hear me talking about placing a bet, and to three or four of my other close friends, like you hear me talking about placing a bet, come and slap me up the face, okay? Like, and yeah, it felt like I didn't know what to do with my time for a good month or so. I was like, what do I actually kind of like do now? And it then felt, this is kind of how we get probably into like my baseball story. is that
Exactly. Yes.
I couldn't watch sport in the UK almost because every time I watched a football match, it was one plastered all over the shirts, all the betting sponsors, plastered all over the advertising boards, and then at halftime, pre-game, even post-game sometime for the next game, it was like Roy Winston going, "Bet in play. You got to bet on this. Bet on the number of corners. Bet on the number of red cards. Bet on how many guys are gonna kind of like get a goal in this game." And it was like I couldn't watch British sport without that kind of being pushed into my mind, and I wanted to kind of go as cold turkey on it as possible. I didn't want to give myself any kind of like inroads into going back into it. And so I was like, I love sport, but I can't really watch football now in the UK. Rugby and cricket weren't as bad. There were still definite elements to it. Obviously, we can talk about spot fixing and talk a little bit later on of what the consequences are of like betting. But yeah, it was, and that gave me like this time to be like, I want to watch some other sport. And yeah, that I actually found a safe haven in baseball because I'd watched baseball before. My dad very much like enjoyed like MLB on 5. He was one of those people who would record games, use the VCR, and would record the game and watch like half an hour of a game each day, like during the week. So sometimes I'd sit down and watch like half an hour of baseball with him. So I knew what baseball was. I knew that I'd found it kind of like interesting, but I didn't know much detail about it. So when we started to talk about like 2012, 2013, I was kind of actually like, you know what? I've watched some NFL games, I've watched some baseball games, I've watched some NBA games. Let's get like interest, try see if I can follow like the American sports.
Okay then. Okay, well, before I ask my next question, I just want to be very clear. Ray Winstone seems like he's quite a tough guy, so I'd like to be very clear that I do not endorse the impression that Russell just did of you, sir.
Have you not seen him saying bet in play? Nah.
Oh no, I absolutely remember the advert that you're referring to, but at no point would I ever dream of doing an impression of you, Mr. Wingstone. And please do not equate me to my guest. I have the utmost respect for my guest, but I also have the utmost respect for you, sir. but yes, moving on. You've in many ways done my job for me. Like, how are you keeping yourself in check? Is it like, I know in the article you talk about your friend Giuseppe, very strong name by the way, and I feel that for many reasons. Very strong name. I know you talk about he would check in with you, like, but I mean, this gambling addiction is something, is an issue that you always have. I believe. Like, how do you keep yourself in check now that we are now years down the line?
Yeah, so I think what I do is like the part of it, like I still said, was part of me thinking that I was smarter than the system.
Sure.
So like I get that fix in other places. So actually playing fantasy sports is something that kind of like helps me with that because it is a place where you kind of like you're doing something fairly similar to betting, but you're, well, depending, like, I don't know. Yeah, there are a couple of leagues that I will spend 20, 30 pounds or whatever to play to be part of, so we can have a trophy or we can have something worthwhile for winning. But it's like that helped me kind of get that fix that I was kind of like was looking to, or what I was driving towards in some regards. So, but and otherwise it's like, yeah, it is. I've noticed over the time, because we're now talking like 12 plus years since kind of there, I know like when I'm kind of like when my personality kind of like ticks in. Like I know when it's kind of like, oh, like, hey, like this is a, like you're thinking about this kind of like, yeah, let's maybe like not do that. Or like I have bet since then. I'm not gone like completely cold turkey afterwards because I feel like I have control of what I would like myself, because I've learned to kind of like, I've been to therapy, I've been to for other things to kind of work out, to understand my own ticks, to work out where these things are coming, where these bad repetitive behaviors come from. And so I know that now, and it means that like I can interact adjacently to kind of like that world and not get pulled in. Like I still like have like I don't have like any betting accounts anymore. Like with like the so the British like betting account sites things, you can actually send something to them to basically say like, don't let me sign up.
Yes.
So like these are like good things they put in place. The fact that these systems kind of have to exist is a isn't great, but like it is something you can do. So basically, like my name is like I can't basically sign up for a British betting account. So it's like I just did that to kind of like to really be like a fairly kind of like simple way of kind of like really just cutting myself off.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. And I should say I will also be including information on those kind of organisations, like the the organisations that allow you to text GamStop, for example, so that you can get yourself onto those registers that Russell mentions. I'll be including details of those in the description of this episode as well. So please do go to those links if you have any issues or if you would like to find out more. I should say though, Russell has again done my job for me in a sense. You can tell that he's also a podcast host, and that he's led me into what my next question was going to be. In that, you've already mentioned that baseball is one of the ways in which you use to get yourself away from gambling, and baseball is forms very much part of your sporting allegiances. So, what are your sporting allegiances? Who you support, and why?
Yeah, so I made that choice of like I wanted to follow American sports. It wasn't necessarily like baseball like originally. It was like I just wanted to follow NFL, NBA, and MLB and be like, yeah, you know what, like let's actually have some rooting interest, not be like, oh, I'm just watching the games and just kind of like enjoying what's happened. I do that in some sports, but I've always found that like actually rooting for someone makes a difference. So um I kind of decided that I wanted to find a city that had like all at least three of the top four. I was never that massively into NHL, but I do like it. But I was like, if they've got three of the four sports, it's like I could go support that city and be like, if I ever do go to the States, it's like, hey, I can go and watch maybe like a couple of games of and enjoy that. So I started making a list, then realized that like most of the major metropolitan cities in the US actually have all three teams. So you weren't really kind of like cutting that list down. And then another maybe British side of me, and maybe coming from the fact that I am a West Bromwich Albion supporter, um, came in that I can't support a winning team. Like I can't, I just couldn't go out and glory hunt. To me, it would have been glory hunting to kind of go and support a team that had won the title in maybe the last like 3 or 4 years. So that became like an impossibility. And in all honesty, I kind of didn't want any good teams because it would still then be kind of like a little bit of like jumping onto the bandwagon. So after doing this, that kind of just left me with a couple of cities, and effectively at that time, the Cavaliers had just lost LeBron James to he'd taken his talents to Southside
The
or whatever.
decision, yes, he had the decision in 2010, yes.
Yeah. So the Cavs were bad, but they weren't anywhere near as good as they used to be. The Browns were awful, and were awful for another 10 years. uh,
Arguably are still awful to a certain extent.
make the postseason, so it's better than it used to be. Yeah, I remember the 0-16 season. So, and then the Indians at the time, now the Guardians, were kind of at that moment a pretty bang average like team around 500. And so yeah, I chose Cleveland as my city to support, knowing little to nothing about the actual city, which then I came to be told by lots of people afterwards that it's a bit of a dump. But
I've never been, so I can't comment.
no, there are quite a few amusing videos about the state of Cleveland. One which finishes with the line, "At least it's not Detroit," but which yeah. But yeah, so that's kind of how I got to that. And baseball became kind of my main focus. I think one, as we talked, like there was this big thing in baseball that gambling is not a thing. Like there were big issues historically. If you go far, far back to the whole Black Sox scandal,
yes,
and if you go more modernly,
yes,
more modernly in like the 70s and 80s with everything around Pete Rose. So it was very much a sport that was like no betting. Like this is this is very much a no-no, and the states in itself legalized kind of sports betting outside basically Vegas at any point. So I kind of felt comfortable like watching these sports, watched for about a season, split across all the others, and then kind of came across the concept of like analytics in baseball. And because that's
Yes.
what I am.
Yeah, I was going to say you strike me. I mean, I don't know you very well, but I've known you for a while now, and you strike me as someone who has a very methodical brain. Like you have a very rational brain, and it's very much drawn to data and statistics and empirical evidence. So is that part of what drew you to baseball? Was that sabermetric side as well?
100%. That's what it came from, just being like, I think baseball would have still been my favorite American sport without that, but that's what took baseball to becoming like my favorite sport. Like it completely overtook everything else because I was like, wow, I enjoy watching this sport from watching the game, the whole social side to it. I think like some of like the pastime and how everything kind of combines together. Absolutely love that. Then I found Baseball Prospectus and Fangraphs, and I was like, "Oh, there are people like me out there who love sport in this way, and they actively like communicate with each other online. There are forums, and there are places to go and talk and chat. And you know what? Some of the people who are the most influential people will chat with anybody. Like in some of those forum places, like there's somebody basically who works now for MLB called Tom Tango, who's effectively one of the godfathers of baseball statistics, as like far as I'm concerned. If you were going to put like a presidential kind of like four people up there, like he would be one of the people up there with like with Bill James. But like he would just like answer people's questions like in forums, and he wrote a book which is called The Book, which is basically about like baseball analytics, and that I got that shipped to like the UK, and I was from then I was like I was in love with the sport. I was like, this is the sport for me. It is analytical, and the analytical change was happening in baseball, already started to happen in baseball. Like if I'd become a baseball fan 10 years earlier, I might have been one of those people shouting at like for like Moneyball to actually like happen and to work.
Yeah,
But I
you,
like
you
the
you would have supported the Oakland A's. You would have been a very intelligent man indeed.
I would probably have supported the A's, or would have probably supported Boston, knowing that obviously that they took on like Bill James or something like
Yeah,
that, and may
sure.
have well just jumped on the bandwagon just before it happened. But alas, I was a few years after that. But yeah, that just drew me in, and that world I then started to like. I watched a lot of games. Like Michael Brantley was like that man for me, who was like my first kind of player that I was like, he's amazing. Like he's the one, like the Doctor Smooth himself, as he was called. It was like it's just amazing, kind of like watching him play. I think in the 2014 season or whatever, he had an absolute like phenomenal season. That was like obviously, and you're up there being like, I was one of the people initially that was just like, oh, I don't know much about this Mike Trout guy, but he can't have been better than than Michael Brantley. An opinion that didn't hold in my head for much time period once I kind of like learned a bit more about analytics. But yeah, that was then that inroad, which then it ticked so many different boxes that it became the sport that I follow.
Sure. Okay then, and it has to be said that baseball is very much a part of your sporting life as now. I believe that you also play the game.
Yes, so I am part of the London Mets organization. I play in the single A leagues in the BBF, so I play for the London Minotaurs, one of the London Mets single A teams. So that came about kind of post COVID. So I used to play a lot of ultimate frisbee when I was at like a university, and afterwards it was very much like a sport that I enjoyed because it was like a competitive sport, but it wasn't full of arseholes, as as sadly quite a lot of like you can't play five-a-side football locally without coming across at least one team that is not particularly fun to play with.
Yeah, I
And
think we can get away with that one instance of a rather crude word, shall we say? I do apologise if anyone is offended by that, but we do all have one.
yeah, and so like and then like playing ultimate frisbee was like if you play like a fringe sport, like everybody just wants everybody else to kind of like to play it. So there aren't really like the same level of kind of like n not fun people to play with. Something I played with a lot of time. COVID happened. Most of my team like left the country. went back home. They were obviously living in London at this point, all that sort of thing. Or people left London, got pregnant, sadly. So basically, I didn't have a team to play with, kind of like in going into that like summer of like 2020, or even and then into like 2021, and it was like, you know what? I've loved baseball. I knew that the London Mets existed, but I was like, I am a 30 something. Am I really gonna like try a new sport again? And then when I looked, I was like, oh, they do a baseball for beginners program. So effectively, they do a 16-week program from like May till like September, where you go along. It is for adults, basically everybody 18 plus, to basically go and learn baseball for the first time. So there was like 55, 60 people signed up, going most Fridays, effectively to learn baseball. And I kind of loved it once. I loved watching it and started loving it once I played it. I had a bit of hand to eye coordination from some of the other things, so it wasn't like horrendous, but realized very quickly that I didn't know how to throw, because you're never like taught like how to throw properly. Like, oh, man, I played cricket a lot as a kid. Never taught us actually how to throw.
Yeah. So and if there's anyone in the London area that's interested in getting involved in baseball, how can they get involved in the London Mets then?
Yeah, so the London Mets has obviously, like, the simplest way is to look at the website, londonmets.org. You'll find information there about if you already have baseball experience. Then there are 8 teams, no, 9 teams, include the women's teams, across various divisions of various levels of ability. So you can kind of like email our adult commissioner to kind of get any information at that. If you're a newcomer, Baseball for Beginners is there. That, like I say, will start in May. So if you're very interested now, you're pretty much getting perfectly for the time for that to start. If we also have youth as well, so if there is anybody, I think from the age of 6 upwards, we're in youth programs that are on Saturdays as well. So yeah, there's a full any age, anybody who wants to kind of learn about baseball and wants to play baseball. Yeah, in the London area, the Mets. So yeah, it's in North London in Finsbury Park.
Okay, and that website again was, Russell?
LondonMets.org.
Okay, great. And you mentioned that you played for the single A team. People
Yes.
who watched previous episodes of the BCS podcast will know that my first guest, Charlie Deeks, plays for the Bristol Buccaneers, the single A team of the Bristol Baseball Club. Have you ever played against him?
I've not. So most of the lower divisions are split like geographically, so you only really play against close teams. The only real chance that we would get to play each other would either be in the Summer Cups, which is kind of the something that the BBF has done, where it runs like a weekend tournament where you can go into the different levels and teams from all over come around, or if we both made it to like the playoff finals or something like that. I've not been on a team that's kind of we've been on like development teams for the last few years that never really had the goal of like making the playoffs. So it's not really been something that I've got the chance to do yet. But yeah, that would be a good one to happen if it could come about.
Okay, and so you heard it here, like Bristol Baseball Club. Russell Eassom very much wants to play the Bristol Buccaneers and see which is the better team. So I think the two of you should get together and organise a game.
It'll always be good fun to actually meet like the people that you've come across from other ways, kind of like to do that on sport. I've come across many people that during even just the games that I've played so far that are like, oh, I listen to Batflips and Nerds, and it's always it's a little bit of a shock sometimes when someone would just go like, are you Russell? And I'm like, yes, and how do you know me? And it's just, oh, I just heard your voice, and I was like, I'm pretty certain, and I was like, okay.
Yeah, well, I think that leads us on to the next part of our discussion. Really, you mentioned that you started to follow American sports because of the absence of betting, and betting is certainly something that has become a lot more prevalent in American sports. I can't watch an NBA game or an NFL game or an MLB game without seeing numerous commercials for betting. So how has that affected you? Like, are you able to enjoy American sports now, or is that something where you think you might need to step away from American sports as well now?
I think I'm in a good enough place that like doesn't. I don't think I'm ever gonna like have to be forced to step away. But what I see is that I can just see what happened to me happening to other people, and that kind of unnerves me from that respect. Not necessarily that it's going to happen to me again. As you've talked about, like the ease of being able to do these sorts of things and it being so actively promoted is just going to get people to make those first bets. And some people don't have an addictive personality. Probably a good 80-90% of people who actually do sports betting keep it perfectly under and reasonable amounts. But I don't think that industries or things should exist that are like okay for 90% of people if it's bad for like 10% of people.
Sure.
Like,
okay.
And
so please go on.
Yeah, and so I think that's what you get into this kind of like you get the weird, I get this weird aspect where almost like I can see like it's a lot of the time it's pre-game, so I avoid a lot of like the pre-game talk because they're usually talking about I bet on like kind of what's going to happen today. I think in-game, I don't know what it's like for NBA because I don't watch too much of that nowadays, but NFL, you just watch Red Zone, so you don't really get. I watch Red Zone apart from maybe the times that I watch Cleveland, so it doesn't really impact that because that's was it 7 hours of commercial-free entertainment, as Scott Henson says. But yeah, in MLB, it has got to that point where it is noticeable. Like you'll start to see it's kind of replaced like we used to have advert breaks, and then we used to have like the in-game advert like pop-up. And I feel that like the in-game advert pop-up is now being replaced with here's the betting odds on something, and you can use Bally Sports, or you can use us like DraftKings, the official sponsor of MLB, or the official sponsor of the Cleveland Guardians, or So all of the teams in the leagues now have like official sport books, which all of this is doing is just making it easier for people to bet, which then just makes it easier for people to get it to lose control.
Yeah, and it should be said, but we are starting to see the effects of this as well, aren't we? I think certainly when it comes to baseball, the most prominent example is that Shohei Ohtani and his interpreter, or ex-interpreter now, have been implicated in a scandal, and it should be said that MLB is investigating that, and so we can't really comment on that while the investigation is going on place. But in the NBA as well, Jonte Porter, who is on a two-way contract with the Toronto Raptors, is also under investigation by his league for supposed infractions. And so if this is happening to the players, then we can only imagine what may or may not be happening to the people who are watching the sports as well.
Yeah, I think that I don't. People aren't really going to try and throw games for money anymore. It's just not worth their time and effort to kind of like to do that. There's so much checking involved in kind of like suspicious results. I don't know how much you're aware of kind of lower level tennis. Was a problem like especially in the last like 5 to 10 years, probably like 5 to 10 years ago, with kind of matches in the kind of like these ATP 100 level, which is like the 500 to 1,000 best people, that suspicious amounts of betting happening on certain games and results going one way or another. Well, they scaled back to, instead of like doing results, they got to the point where like they would be betting on a certain number of double faults happening, or a certain number of like specific things happening in a game. So we call it like spot bets, or I think Americans call it like prop bets. And so these individual moments that don't necessarily affect a game's outcome, people can very be easily influenced to do this, because a lot of people who play sport aren't paid a lot of money. The people who are working hard to kind of reach that top level in tennis, they're not paid a lot. Obviously in NBA and in baseball, the people that we're talking about, yes, it can make a bit of money, but baseball, we have the minor league baseball, which there's a lot of people that don't get paid. In college, there was issues last year, I think, around some coaches being involved in potentially kind of like shaving like results or changing like over and under lines by benching players like during the game, because that's something they have control of. So like it just allows people to be influenced by gambling. And it's not only just the seedy side of it when I'm talking about like maybe like organized crime or that side of it. It affects people who just then are also the bystander who just wants to kind of like to bet on something and just slowly kind of goes out of control. So yeah, it gets into a really dangerous kind of minefield where people talk about, well, how do you do this safely?
Yeah, and you know, I think you've hit on a very good point here. Is to your mind, do you think that is where the issue is in the spot betting, the prop betting aspects of it? Because it's not affecting the end result, but there's a lot of money that can be bet on those spots or on those props, and it should be said that is the allegation against John T. Porter in the NBA, is that he was fixing spots allegedly. So
yeah,
like,
I think how the leagues are going to be impacted are players are going to be willing to do that. Like, because they're going to, I'm not throwing a game, or like probably when you get to the level where you can throw a game, they're probably already earning tens of millions. So they're not going to throw a game. The stuff that's against Otani, no idea, like whether it is him or whether it was Ipe. That just seems to be a vast swathes amounts of money bet the old fashioned way through a back end like bookie, which is just, it's a very old school kind of gambling thing. It's not like the modern kind of issue we've had with gambling. So I think how the leagues are going to get in trouble with gambling is prop bets and
yeah,
players
and
getting involved in this.
and it should be said that part of the issue with Otani and his now ex-interpreter is partly because gambling is illegal in California, not necessarily that gambling was taking place, because in the MLB they do allow players to bet on other sports, just not on baseball itself.
Yeah, and it's more specifically with the Otani one, I think California does now allow betting, but what it doesn't allow is like you have to pay up front. And so effectively the side of what it was seemingly with the fact of what the federal government found is that like these back payments were being paid like after kind of like betting debt had been raised, which is like a whole way of kind of like a whole different kettle of fish in how these sorts of things work. So yeah, the leagues have opened themselves up for people to question their integrity.
Like,
And
what do you think the what do you think the solution is ultimately? Because and this is something I should have raised earlier, but like I strongly encourage people to go to the website and to read Russell's article in full. But there are two stats in the article that Russell wrote, and I know that these are to be true because I'm the one that went and made sure that they were true on Russell's behalf before we published the article. The economic cost to the British government associated with harmful gambling is equivalent to a roughly 413 million. However, the government makes approximately 3.5 billion in tax from gambling in the UK. And so for you, what is the solution? Because clearly there is a financial incentive for the government to allow gambling to continue. And if that's true in the UK, it's also going to be true in the US as well.
yeah, and frankly, there's no government that's going to say no. Like you're basically killing your tax budget to do this. So while basically we do not have any massively left-leaning government that has existed in a major country, I don't think anybody's going to do anything about gambling apart from set up the systems to help the people who have got too involved in gambling. And I think what you're seeing maybe in the UK a little bit is removing the prevalence of some of the uber in your face sponsorships. So I think the Football League which is not the Premier League, but like the English Football League, the leagues below, are removing gambling teams from being allowed to like sponsor teams. Premier League has discussed this, not really kind of got into it yet, but we've seen kind of these things change in recent. Teams seem to be moving away from those sorts of deals. So I think you might see in English sport that the the prevalence of these kind of gambling massively in your face may decline, but the ability to easily bet is not going away. I think they're just trying to say that like, oh, it's not as in your face, so people aren't going to kind of get brought into that world like straight away or easier than they were done beforehand. So that's like what we see in the UK. In the US, they're like at the start of this wave. Like we're talking 20 years in the UK since these sorts of things started to happen and become like a massive problem. Like I don't see much happening in the US for a long time over this. Like I think the sports, if we talk from a baseball perspective, there is potentially a revenue issue right now because they are all talking around losing their like local network like deals around television broadcasting deals. So there's been like
that is specifically prevalent and a concern with a network called Diamond, I believe.
yeah. So they took over. So Diamond and which kind of have like the Bally Sports, quite a lot of those stuff run through. Like they took over a load of the contracts and then basically kind of defaulted on a few of them being like, yeah, this isn't going to make us money, so we're just going to opt out of the contracts. Obviously, still pay a huge kind of like cost, but effectively we're not going to sink this cost for months coming. And so teams are looking for different ways to generate revenue, and a nice juicy finance deal or a corporate deal from a sponsor, a gambling sponsor, is going to light up their eyes. Like we saw the way that the league has interpreted these sorts of things. Like, just not go into it too far, but hey, FTX was all over a lot of the stuff, obviously from a failed cryptocurrency market. So the league and the teams want whatever revenue they could possibly get and whatever guaranteed revenue they can possibly get right now. So they're not going to turn away gambling money. It's going to be, we have to basically have either a super serious issue, i.e. Shohei Ohtani was betting on major league things, and maybe sometimes like when he had an injury and he left early with a blister, there was money on the line. I don't think I will preface this, but I don't think that is the case, and I don't think that is the case because the suspicious betting pattern would have been around, those sorts of things would have already been picked up if there were suspicious betting patterns around kind of what it is. But if something of that scale were to happen, it would make the sports have to kind of reconsider like their arrangement with these industries. But right now, it's kind of like the current cash cow, and sadly, that's what talks to sports owners and to sports leagues. So there isn't much that we can kind of, as fans, that we can really do in the interim.
Yeah, and just one last point on this before we move on. The Premier League have announced that front of shirt betting firm sponsorship will be ended in 2026. But they will continue to have fan side displays on the advertising hoarding. So, like, what, if any, effect do you think that will have?
It's a weird one because like, obviously like people wear the shirts out and around in other places, so that kind of gives you an idea. Like I definitely grew up not knowing what like Sao beer was, or was it Ching as well? Like so these sorts of advertising things do bring things to my attention that I was not aware of like previously. I didn't make me go and want to buy any of those beers, but I did go look them up and see that they are a beer. So yes, it means that it's going to be less in the face of people. Yes, hopefully it means that then you don't have kids walking around walking advertisements for gambling, which is probably
it should be said gambling sponsors are not on children's shirts. Haven't been for a long time, but children nowadays, if they're anything like me, were having to wear adult sizes when they were a child.
Yeah, and I think some kids will want the real jersey. Like to them, they won't care that it's like it's a sponsor. So what this will do is it will change the way that the gambling industry interacts with like the Premier League. So I imagine that I'm pretty certain that all stadiums and all teams have like a specific gambling company that runs like betting shops like inside the stadium. Like I know West Brom has a deal with somebody, can't remember off the top of my head, but there are specific like betting booths inside the stadium that they have a specific contract with. So it's not really going to it's going to like disappear from some of the visibility, but it's still going to be there. So yeah, a lot of the thing, sadly, is it has to come from a governmental perspective, and unless you can basically replace the tax money with something else, governments aren't going to make changes. Like maybe here in the UK, I'm out here saying that what we should do is legalize cannabis and then ban gambling, and then you'll switch the tax money around. Not saying if that's going to work, just a completely ludicrous hypothetical.
Sure.
But yeah, almost no. Not to say that it's not sane, but like no government is going to turn down $3.8 billion worth of tax money, sadly.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's I'm very conscious of time, Russell, and I'm very conscious that I'd like to try to end on a happy note. One of the things that I'm aware that you've had the chance to do from getting involved in baseball was that you were Britain's only accredited press source at the World Baseball Classic in Arizona last year. You know, how did you find yourself in that position? And please do tell us, what was it like to be in Arizona for the World Baseball Classic last year?
Yeah, so what slight alteration, Gav was there as well for a few days as well.
So
So
yes, Gavin is our webmaster at Batflips and Nerds, and my editor, and a fine human being he is.
yeah, so the two of us he was there for like the Arizona games, so I went over to like the Miami games and stuff like that. So a lot of that just comes from Batflips and Nerds. Like for me, it was back in 2017. I started to go to a couple of like the fan meets in the UK, and I met John McGee at one of those. Um, and he was like, "Oh yeah, like I've got this podcast, I've got this like site or whatever with some friends," and I started listening to the podcast, started like looking at the website, and I'd been doing a bit of blogging about like analytics kind of elsewhere, and then I was like, yeah, you know what, like the job that I was doing at that time occupied about 60% of my actual time, so I just started writing a lot of articles. If you go back to I think probably like 2018, maybe even Twitter, like I'm probably posting something like once a week, and all kind of fairly analytical articles as well, talking about things because that's pretty much what I was doing with my time at work instead of actually working because they didn't give me enough work to do, and I was basically like, well, if you're not going to give me work, then I'll say everything I've done and will take 3 days what it'll take one. And so yeah, from that basically I just started to write a lot, and got some interaction with like people outside the site, drew kind of things that I came onto the pod once as like a guest, and then as it just continued on from there to the point where I don't know how much you know about Absolute Bunts or not, which was like another baseball podcast that was run for a while by a couple of guys called John McKenzie and Henry, and they basically just ran on this whole campaign of like free Russell and put him like on the podcast because like I was just like they were, and so yeah, it spitballed from there, and then eventually like the guys like the original four like John, Tom Pringle, Darius Austin, and Ben Carter were like, "Hey, like we don't have all of the time that we used to have to kind of spend on this," and they were like, "Hey, myself, Rob, Gav, and Rachel at the time, can you kind of help us like step up and kind of start to do podcasts?" And once that happened, like I became kind of like a more permanent member of Batflips and Nerds, and since the start of Batflips and Nerds, we'd been in interactions with kind of what was MLB London at some point, or what was MLB UK at like some point. John and that lot had interactions with Charlie Hill, who is now, I think, the VP of like baseball in like Asia, which is like a huge kind of like of people like of MLB baseball like in Asia, and so from a very early beginnings, we just kind of worked with MLB Europe or MLB UK, and just when there were fan events, we helped kind of like run stuff. We kind of going through that managed to wangle our way onto the MLB accreditation page, and from speaking to other people, like once you're on accreditation pages, it's very, unless you basically lose that accreditation, you kind of just keep it. So we just then like used it for a couple, like obviously like, the London series happened, and that was a massive push back in like 2019 for all of these sorts of things, and it grew and it developed, and like the site continued to grow and develop, and MLB Europe were really happy with everything that we did from that perspective, and the guys went and did like press days for that. And so once it grew from then, it was like, oh, okay, like let's just try and make sure that we continue this relationship, and we'll have like good access to anything that kind of does happen. And then in 2022, GB went and qualified for the World Baseball Classic, which was partially a shock, possibly not a shock. The team which Drew managed to put together was easily the best team that like GB has ever managed to put together before. A lot of good prospects, a lot of good like Bahamian and Jamaican players, and a lot of people who had played major, had some minor league experience came across, and they qualified through Regensburg, and it was like, oh, like they're going to be at the World Baseball Classic in 2023. Like nearly went to the qualifier. Obviously, I went to Arizona to cover the qualifiers in 2020 that got cancelled when COVID happened. So we were all kind of like, oh yeah, we're gonna do this. We want to be involved in like the journey of British baseball. And so yeah, like once GB qualified, I was like, I've immediately booked like the 3 weeks off that like the World Baseball Classic was happening. And I was like, I'm taking this off as holiday. And just being like, no matter what happens, I'm taking this off as holiday. Luckily for me, well, let's say luckily, I got made redundant a couple of months beforehand, got a massive, nice package. And I was like, well, now I can have like a whole month of holiday and not even have to like think or care or just enjoy myself to kind of like the absolute max. And yeah, thankfully, I do have to say thanks to John and all the guys beforehand to kind of starting that relationship. But we've worked with MLB Europe, and they were like, we put in the request for credentials. We sent a message to MLB Europe that we've done it, and they were just like, yeah, sure, we'll kind of like get that done. And then when me and Gav got the approved email, it was like, oh man, this is actually now happening. Like this was like, oh, I actually now have to be proper press, not just like, oh, I'd used the press credentials a couple of times when I'd been in the States to kind of go and sit in the press box and watch baseball games and be like, well, I'll write something about this experience, and done that. So I've done that at Cleveland. I'd done that sneakily in a couple of other places because it was a fun thing to do. And then it was like, oh no, like this is actually worthwhile being and done proper, because there's only going to be one time that GB get there for the first time.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that lanyard hanging over your right shoulder is your accreditation to the World Baseball Classic, or is it
100% you are
accreditation to
correct. It is
Okay,
it is my accreditation to the World Baseball Classic. I effectively, the two things, if you're looking at the video version of this, these are the two things that decorate my house. I don't have any other personalized decorations in this flat. I've lived here for nearly 2 years. I have a painting done by Andy Brown, who is absolutely phenomenal and would be somebody that I would very much recommend you go on the pod and have a chat with if you want to talk about how baseball or how sport can like affect someone's life, and the paintings that he does. And then the other one, which you can see a little bit further back, is the press accreditation. And that 3 weeks, honestly, was probably the best 3 weeks of my life.
And do you think you'll go to the World Baseball Classic again as a press member?
In 2026 is when the next one will be, and all things kind of considered, yeah, I will very much look to kind of to go again. I'm kind of half hoping that we end up in Japan or Taiwan for one of the group stages and not the US this time, so I can go out and enjoy it from that perspective. But if it's in the States again, it'll be phenomenal, like no matter what. It was firstly kind of getting in that stadium and watching GB play the USA, and we lost, but we weren't spanked, we weren't mercied. It wasn't like anything that didn't make ourselves look like we were completely nearly out of our depth. And it was like, oh, this is amazing to be there. Seeing GB win a game was just unbelievable. We'd made friends with a couple of people in the press box because we'd sat in similar seats the whole entire time. And I kind of subtly asked one of them as the game was coming close to being finished, like, how much is an overreaction in the press box? And he's like, dude, go crazy. Like, It's like if you win, go crazy because this is unbelievable. Like no one, yeah, GB maybe like drew in a few of the players, but like we can do this. But we really think that they would upset some of those teams, not necessarily. So that win was utterly phenomenal, and getting to knowing the fact that I've met some of those players, I've met some of them before. I've met Drew a long time ago. Drew actually used to coach at like the London Mets, had been like involved in the system for like a very long time. So I'd met Drew 7 or 8 years ago, and seeing kind of all the stuff that had gone through there was just phenomenal to see. And then MLB weren't just didn't give us credentials for those group stages. They also said, oh yeah, if you want to go on to Miami, you can have credentials for the whole thing in Miami as well. So I then went and watched 5 of the best atmosphere games I think I've seen in all sport. Not just like baseball, like the atmosphere of those games that were in Lone Depot Park, which comes to probably most MLB fans knowing that there can actually be an atmosphere in Lone Depot Park is 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 but it was utterly insane. Like the crowds were so loud, especially the Venezuela versus USA match, which was to and fro, and I would have said was close to 50-50 of having USA fans and Venezuela fans, even though this is in like Miami, which obviously has a fairly like huge kind of like Hispanic influence, but it was the noise was unbelievable, and the final games like Japan hitting a walk off, and then it finishing with like Shohei Ohtani striking out Mike Trout. Like if you'd written your anime or you'd written your movie, you'd put
Yeah,
that
exactly.
you'd put that at the end, and someone would be like, "No, you can't do that. That's too on the nose."
Yeah, the storyline was perfect in that regard. Yes,
Yeah.
I should say, Russell, we've spoke for over an hour at this point, and the time has flown by, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. So I think I will end on one final question. Please do tell us, what is that hat that you're wearing? What team does it represent?
So this is the Myrtle Beach Pelicans. So basically, like the Angry Pelican is kind of like one of their kind of like alternate options for their jersey. They are a single A affiliate, I think, for the Chicago Cubs, based like in North Carolina. That's where Myrtle Beach is. I think it's North
Yep.
Carolina. Um, Once again, it's just to me like the minor league hats are just amazing. Like a lot of them, I love them. A little bit behind me, you could probably see some more that are kind of like, if I can point, like got more
Yes.
things like over here. Like, well, actually, that's the Serpentis one, but then there's a Green Jackets one, and so many other things. Like, I love the hats that you can get from minor league baseball, and we just kind of at one point, the Batflips and Nerds just started chatting to the Pelicans team on Twitter, and then they were then like, "Do you guys want like some merch? Like, we paid for it, but they were like, we'll sort out like shipping to like the UK, and so we just got a load of merch, and it's just great fun."
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, I'm very glad to hear that, and I think what I would say I'm even more glad about is that you were able to find baseball at a time when you needed to find an alternative sport, and for my sake, for your sake, for everyone's sake, I hope that you feel that you are still able to watch that sport, because if you feel that you can still watch baseball, then it means that gambling hasn't taken the sport over completely. And in my opinion, at least, that the sport would be all the better for it, because I know I certainly have not enjoyed seeing how much gambling has encroached upon US sports in with the advertisements and the in-game advertisements and all that as well. So yeah, long may your baseball fandom continue. But for now, thank you so much for joining me, Russell. It's been an absolute delight to chat to you for this last hour.
No, cheers, Brett, and obviously all the best to yourselves, and thank you for having me.
All right, thanks a lot, man. Speak to you again. Bye bye. So there you have it. I think that was an absolutely fascinating chat with Russell there, and I'd like to thank him for his time and for being willing to speak so openly about an issue that can be very embarrassing for a lot of people who have to deal with sports betting or gambling addiction as a whole. We spoke for over an hour there, and quite frankly, there's so much stuff that we didn't cover that we could have covered that is incredibly important. For example, this past weekend was WrestleMania 40, and I'm gonna predicate this. How do I say this? I'm gonna predicate this comment with one caveat and say that I historically am a fan of professional wrestling. If anyone knows me, they know that I have the utmost respect for professional wrestlers and what they do. But professional wrestling ultimately is a predetermined event, and it has to be said that in the past, both AEW and WWE, or what was known as the World Wrestling Federation when I was a kid, they have both had partnerships with a sportsbook in the past, and that for me is potentially very worrying, that people can put bets on something where the outcome is predetermined. And for me, that can only work if there is very much a separation between the people who are setting the odds and the person or people who are making the booking decisions, but also are setting what are known as the high spots in wrestling. You know, that conversation that I just had with Russell, we talked about prop betting or spot betting, and high spots are a big thing in wrestling, and so that has to be in mind when it comes to betting on those kinds of events. You know, there's potential for a very big scandal there, and so I would hope that any sports book and any professional wrestling company that is going into a partnership with each other make sure that they are doing everything they can to show that everything they are doing in that partnership is very much above board, and that there can be no suspicion of impropriety. And that's only one tiny part of what is a wider sports betting industry. You know, sports betting in the UK alone was worth over £14 billion. You know, that's not to mention just how much money the betting industry is increasingly becoming worth in the US. And so for me, and as Russell mentioned in the chat, it's, you know, sports betting in the US in particular is in a nascent period, and it's going to be very interesting to see how things develop. It's going to be very interesting to see the harm that could come, and we're already seeing the harm that is coming to people in the US because of sports betting, and how bad could that potentially get. For now though, I think we have to park the issue, and I have to say that is the end of this episode, and thank you very much for joining me. As I mentioned in the chat, there are links below to the article that I mentioned that Russell wrote last year. There's also links below to organisations in both the US and the UK that you can find more information about if you are potentially struggling with a gambling addiction. You know, please do make use of those resources, and you know, and I very much hope that you're able to tackle the issue and get yourself to a better place. You know, for now though, thank you very much for joining me. You know, I very much enjoyed recording this episode with Russell and educating myself as much as anything, and I hope it's been educational and informative for you as well. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye bye now. The BCS Podcast is written, produced, edited and hosted by me, Brett Walker. Thank you to Music Unlimited and Pictorbay for the use of the music and sound effects. This week's guest was Russell Eassom.